Arthur Lindquist stood on the front lawn of the house he had lived in for 31 years, watching two men he'd never met carry his recliner down the porch steps and load it into a truck that did not belong to him, and it was his own son Nathan, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that reminded Arthur, painfully, of Nathan's mother in her worst moods, who finally said the sentence that would replay in Arthur's mind for months afterward. "I'm sorry, Dad, but you're homeless now, we can't keep doing this." Arthur, 78 years old, a suitcase at his feet that a mover had packed for him that morning, while he was out at his cardiologist appointment, stood very still on the grass, and tried to make sense of a sentence. Did not seem to belong to the son he'd raised, because a man does not simply wake up one Tuesday and become homeless in the house he himself had lived in since Nixon was in office. Not unless something had shifted, quietly and completely, underneath him without his ever being told. He asked Nathan, in a voice that came out smaller than he intended, where exactly he was supposed to go, and Nathan, not quite meeting his father's eyes, said that Diane's mother had found him a room at a place called Fairview Residences, a modest assisted living facility 2 towns over, fully paid for the first 3 months, and that it was, Nathan said, the responsible thing, the thing that made sense for everyone given how the finances had gotten, and Arthur understood, standing there with his life packed into 3 suitcases, and a recliner disappearing into a stranger's truck, that the phrase Diane's mother had found him a room was the sentence that actually explained everything, because Diane's mother was a woman named Helen Draper. And Arthur had known, the very first time he'd shaken her hand at Nathan and Diane's engagement dinner 11 years earlier, that he had met her before, decades earlier, under circumstances that had nearly destroyed his family the first times. He stood on that lawn for a long while after the truck pulled away, longer than he needed to, watching the porch light he'd replaced himself only the previous summer, and he thought, absurdly, of the afternoon 31 years ago, when he and Margaret had first walked through that same front door as a young married couple. Margaret laughing about the ugly wallpaper in the hallway that they'd torn down themselves that same weekend, and he thought of Nathan as a boy of 6, learning to ride a bicycle on that very driveway, Arthur running alongside him with one hand on the seat until he finally let go, and Nathan wobbled forward and stayed upright and turned around, astonished, calling out, "Dad, look, I'm doing it," and Arthur, 78 years old now, found it very hard to reconcile that small triumphant voice with the man who had just stood in the doorway telling him he was homeless. A neighbor 2 houses down, an older woman named Sylvie Marchetti, who had lived on Sycamore Court, nearly as long as Arthur had, came out onto her own porch when she saw the moving truck and called over, worried, asking if everything was all right. And Arthur, not wanting to embarrass Nathan in front of the whole street, only said that he was doing some downsizing, a phrase that tasted like ash in his mouth even as he said it. Because downsizing was a word for a choice, and nothing about what had just happened to him had felt, even for 1 second, like a choice of his own. To understand how a 78-year-old man ends up standing on his own lawn, being told he's homeless by his own son, you have to go back 9 years, to the spring after Arthur's wife Margaret died, when Arthur, grieving and increasingly aware of his own mortality, had sat down with Nathan and Diane at their kitchen table, to talk about the future of the house on Sycamore Court, the same house where Nathan had grown up, and it was Helen Draper, present at that dinner as Diane's mother. And already, by then, positioning herself as the family's de facto financial advisor on the strength of a decades-old paralegal career, and a confident, reassuring manner that made complicated things sound simple, who suggested, gently and with what seemed at the time like genuine care, that Arthur consider transferring the deed to Nathan now, while he was healthy, rather than waiting for it to pass through a will some. It was called Medicaid planning, Helen explained, patient and warm, sliding a legal pad across the table with a simple diagram already drawn on it, a common and perfectly legal strategy that protected a family home from being swallowed up by nursing home costs down the road, and Arthur, still raw from Margaret's death and grateful for anyone willing to handle the parts of adult life that suddenly felt too heavy to carry alone, signed the paperwork. Helen's own attorney friend drew up 3 weeks later, transferring full ownership of the house to Nathan, believing, the way a trusting man believes most things told to him by people who sound certain, that he would simply go on living in it, exactly as he always had. A guest now, in name only, but never in practice, for the first several years, that promise held, more or less, and Arthur told himself the arrangement had been a wise one, the sensible move of a careful man planning ahead, the way he'd planned every other part of his life, but underneath the calm surface of those years, Helen Draper had been doing something Arthur did not yet understand, quietly, patiently reshaping the family's understanding of who Arthur was and what he was owed, the same way, Arthur would later learn, she had done to someone else entirely, decades earlier, long before Nathan or Diane had ever been born, because Arthur had, in fact, met Helen Draper once before, in the early 1980s, when she went by a different last name, and ran the back office of a small commercial trucking company, in partnership with Arthur's own younger brother, Raymond, and it was that old, buried history, more than anything happening in the present, that would eventually explain everything. Raymond Lindquist had been 3 years younger than Arthur, sharper in business than Arthur ever was. And for most of their 20s the two brothers had been close, in the easy, uncomplicated way brothers sometimes are before life gives them anything to disagree about, until Raymond partnered with a young, ambitious bookkeeper, named Helen Voss, as she was known then, to build a small regional trucking outfit that grew, within a few years, into something genuinely profitable. Arthur, working a steady job at the county utility company, and never quite as comfortable with financial risk as his brother, had loaned Raymond a modest sum in the company's second year to cover a cash flow gap. An ordinary brotherly kindness that should have meant nothing more than that. Except that 18 months later, Raymond confronted Arthur furiously at a family cookout, accusing him of quietly siphoning money out of the business through a side account Arthur had supposedly opened without Raymond's knowledge, an accusation Arthur denied with total, bewildered honesty because he had never once touched the company's books. Arthur remembered that afternoon with a clarity that had never faded in 30 years, remembered Raymond's face gone red and furious in front of their own parents, remembered saying, over and over, "Ray, I don't know what you think you found, but it wasn't me, I swear on Mom's life it wasn't me," and remembered, worse than the accusation itself, the moment he understood that his brother simply did not believe him, had already decided that, based on whatever Helen had shown him, that Arthur was lying, and that no amount of pleading was going to undo a ledger. Raymond had already trusted more than his own brother's word. The two brothers, each too proud, and too hurt to back down, said things to each other that Tuesday afternoon, that neither one of them, ever, fully took back, and within a year, Raymond had bought Arthur's small ownership stake out at a lowball price. Just to sever the connection entirely, and the two brothers spoke perhaps a dozen times total, over the following 3 decades. Mostly at their own parents' funerals. Never once resolving what had actually happened between them. Until Raymond died of a heart attack 11 years ago, estranged, wealthy and alone, leaving Arthur with a grief that had no clean shape to it at all, guilt and anger and loss all tangled together, with no way to ever ask his brother, one last time, what he actually believed had happened all those years ago, what Arthur did not know, what he would not learn, until a lawyer he'd never met called him nearly a year after he was put out of his own house, was that the side account Raymond had accused him of secretly opening had, in fact, existed, real and documented, and had been opened not by Arthur at all but by Helen Voss herself, quietly skimming a percentage of the trucking company's receivables into an account under a name close enough to Arthur's that a hurried, betrayed 26-year-old Raymond, shown a doctored ledger by his own trusted bookkeeper, had never thought to look any closer, and that Helen, understanding immediate how convenient it would be to Raymond's own brother positioned as the villain rather than herself, had simply let the accusation stand and quietly continued, skimming for another 2 years afterward, walking away eventually with a modest fortune of her own and a business partner who trusted her completely precisely because he believed she'd helped him catch the real thief. It was this same woman, 40 years older now, going by her married name Draper, who had walked back into Arthur's life at his son's engagement dinner, and Arthur, grieving Margaret, exhausted, and unable to quite place where he recognized her from beyond a vague, uneasy familiarity he chalked up to a lifetime of meeting people, had simply never made the connection, because the last time he'd seen her clearly, he had been a young man in his 30s, and the accusation that ended his relationship with his brother had always, in his own mind, been Raymond's mistake, never Helen's crime. Once Helen recognized Arthur at that engagement dinner, and understood immediately that he had no idea who she really was or what she'd once done to his family. She made a calculation that would define the next decade, deciding that the safest possible path forward was not to avoid the Lindquist family, but to imagine herself as deeply and as usefully within it as she possibly could, becoming the trusted advisor, the generous grandmother figure, the woman with all the practical answers. So that if Arthur's memory of that old betrayal ever did resurface, it would be dismissed as the confused suspicion of an old man against a woman the whole family had already come to depend on and adore. Helen had spent the years since the trucking company built a modest, respectable career as a paralegal, and had told herself, across those decades, a story about her younger self that made the theft easier to live with. That Raymond had been careless with money, and would have run the company into the ground without her steady hand managing it, that what she'd taken had simply been fair compensation for keeping the whole enterprise afloat, that Arthur, whatever happened to him afterward, had lost nothing she considered truly hers to protect. This was, Arthur would later understand, the same long patient game she had played with his brother decades earlier, and the house transfer had simply been, its next chapter, an arrangement that gave her, through her own daughter and son-in-law, effective influence over the largest asset in Arthur's life. An influence she began exercising in earnest 3 years later when Nathan's construction supply business hit a rough stretch, and Helen, ever helpful, suggested that perhaps it was time to think seriously about downsizing, about what made sense for a family stretched as thin as theirs, about whether an old man really needed 4 bedrooms to himself when a modest room in a well-run assisted living facility, fully staffed and fully paid for out of the eventual sale of the house, might genuinely be the more comfortable and more responsible arrangement for everyone. Nathan, worn down by financial stress and grateful, in the specific way a struggling man is grateful, for anyone offering him a clean, confident solution to a problem he was too tired to solve himself, absorbed this framing slowly over many months, the same way Arthur's own brother had once absorbed a fabricated story about a side account, until the morning Arthur went to his cardiologist appointment and came home to find his own furniture being carried out to a truck. Arthur spent his first 3 nights not at Fairview residences, which he refused outright the moment he understood what it actually was, a room paid for, with money that would come from selling the roof over his own head. But at the home of Frank Delgado, an old co-worker from the utility company who'd stayed close with Arthur across 4 decades of retirement fishing trips. And it was Frank, sitting across from him at a kitchen table considerably smaller and considerably kinder than the one Arthur had eaten breakfast for 31 years, who finally said out loud the thing Arthur had been circling for days without quite landing on it. That something's about this whole arrangement, going all the way back to the deed transfer 9 years earlier, smelled less like a grieving widower being cared for by his family, and more like a grieving widower being managed by someone with an angle. And that if Arthur intended to fight this, he needed a lawyer who understood exactly that difference. Arthur, staring down at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, admitted to Frank, something he hadn't quite admitted even to himself yet, that he'd recognized Helen Draper's face the very first time he shook her hand at that engagement dinner, some old, uneasy flicker of familiarity he'd never been able to place, and that he'd spent 11 years telling himself it was nothing, an old man's fading memory playing tricks. Because the alternative, that the woman his son's whole family had come to depend on was connected somehow to the worst wound of his own life, had simply been too enormous a thing to consider on a night that was supposed to be about celebrating Nathan's happiness. Frank, who had known Arthur since they were both 26 years old sorting the same utility routes, said only that in 40 years of watching Arthur worry over every decision twice before making it, he had never once seen him get a bad feeling about a person that turned out to be nothing, and that maybe it was time, finally, to stop assuming his own instincts were the thing at fault. The attorney Frank found him, a sharp, unhurried elder law specialist named Patricia Vance, who had built a reputation across 3 counties for cases involving exactly this kind of quiet family exploitation, listened to Arthur's entire account over their first meeting without interrupting once, and then told him something that steadied him for the difficult months ahead. That the original deed transfer, 9 years earlier, might well have been legally valid on its face. An ordinary and common estate planning tool that thousands of families used honestly every year. But that the pattern surrounding it, the steady erosion of Arthur's practical control over the property. Despite promises otherwise, the manufactured financial pressure, the conveniently timed sale coinciding with a medical appointment that kept Arthur out of the house during the actual move. All of it, taken together, painted a picture of undue influence that a court would take seriously, and that they would need, as in every case like this, patience and paper rather than outrage. Patricia asked Arthur, at that first meeting, to write down everything he could remember about Helen's involvement in the family's decisions over the past 9 years. Every question, every meeting, every time her name had come up in a conversation about money, and Arthur, sitting at Frank's kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him, found the list growing longer than he expected, a decade's worth of small nudges that had each seemed reasonable on its own, and now, laid end to end, looked like nothing so much as a slow, deliberate current carrying him steadily toward exactly the shore he'd just been dumped on. It was Patricia who, digging into county records to establish exactly how and when the sale of the Sycamore Court house had been arranged, discovered that Nathan had signed a purchase agreement with a buyer 4 months earlier, well before Arthur's cardiologist appointment, meaning the entire eviction had been planned and scheduled around Arthur's absence, rather than sprung on the family, suddenly, by financial desperation, a discovery that told Arthur, more clearly than anything else so far, exactly how deliberately Helen had orchestrated the timing to spare everyone, meaning herself, an uncomfortable confrontation. It was Patricia, too, following a hunch after Arthur mentioned his estranged brother almost as an aside, who placed a call to the county probate records office and discovered something that would reshape the entire case. An estate file for Raymond Lindquist, closed 11 years earlier, that included a reference to a trust neither Arthur nor, apparently, anyone else in the surviving family had ever been formally notified about, a modest but real trust naming Arthur as sole beneficiary, established quietly by Raymond in the final 2 years of his life, and administered, oddly, by a small trust company, rather than any attorney the Lindquist family had ever used, structured to remain dormant and unadvertised, until triggered by a specific condition written into its terms. A condition that Patricia, reading the trust document for the first time, in her office with Arthur sitting across from her in stunned silence, explained was almost unheard of in her 20 years of practice. The trust would only release its funds and its full documentation to Arthur if he ever formally lost primary control of his own residence, whatever that residence happened to be at the time. A condition so specific and so strange that Patricia said, quietly, that whoever drafted it clearly understood exactly what kind of danger Raymond feared his brother might someday face. The trust company, once formally petitioned, released along with the funds a sealed letter Raymond had written and left with his attorney years before his death, and it was this letter, more than any single legal document in the entire case, that gave Arthur something he had waited 30 years to receive, an explanation. Raymond wrote that he had learned the truth about Helen's embezzlement only in the final years of his own life. Quite by accident, when a forensic review conducted during an unrelated tax dispute turned up the old doctored ledgers, and the account structure that had never actually belonged to Arthur at all. And that by the time he understood what had really happened, what he had accused his own brother of for 30 years out of nothing but a bookkeeper's convenient lie, he had been too proud, too ashamed, and frankly too sick by then to make the phone call he knew he owed Arthur, choosing instead, in the quiet guilty logic of a dying man, trying to fix what he could no longer fix directly, to build a trust that would only ever matter if Arthur someday found himself vulnerable in exactly the way Raymond now understood Helen Draper was capable of making people vulnerable. A strange, sideways apology delivered from beyond the grave because Raymond could never quite manage to deliver it face to face, while he was alive to do it properly. Arthur read that letter twice through, alone in Frank Delgado's guest room, and found himself crying in a way he had not cried since Margaret's funeral, not from anger, though the anger was there too, but from the specific grief of understanding that his brother had spent his final years quietly trying to protect him from a woman Raymond himself had never lived long enough to fully expose. And that the protection had worked, had reached across a decade of silence and death, to find Arthur at precisely the moment he needed it most. Patricia moved quickly, once the trust letter was in hand, combining it with the county records showing the timeline of Nathan's sale agreement and a forensic accountant's fresh review of Helen's decades-old trucking company ledgers, which Patricia had requested purely as supporting context and which confirmed, in cold modern detail, exactly what Raymond's letter had already described, and brought the entire case, both the old fraud and the new one, to a mediation meeting that Nathan, once shown the documents himself, insisted on attending, without his mother-in-law present at all. Telling Arthur beforehand, in a voice thick with shame, Arthur recognized because he'd heard something like it in his own brother's letter, that he needed to hear the whole truth without Helen in the room shaping how he heard it. The mediation, when it finally happened, did not include the dramatic shouting Arthur had once imagined in his angriest hours at Frank's kitchen table. Helen arrived composed. The same warm, unshakable confidence Arthur remembered from the engagement dinner, 11 years earlier. And it held for the first several minutes, right up until Patricia slid across the table, not just the current sale documents, but a single page from the old trucking company ledger. The one showing an account opened under a name. One letter different from Arthur's, in handwriting a forensic document examiner had already matched to Helen's own decades-old signature samples, pulled from old business filings, and Arthur watched something in her face finally give way. Not to tears exactly, but to a stillness that told him she understood, at last, that the ledger she'd buried for 4 decades had finally been dug back up. Arthur spoke only once during the entire meeting, telling Helen, in the plain, steady voice his brother had never quite gotten to use with her while he was alive, that he had spent 30 years believing his own brother had simply stopped loving him, when in fact it had been her signature all along that ended their relationship, and that, whatever she'd told herself over the decades to make that theft feel survivable, it had cost 2 brothers 30 years they could never get back, and he intended to make sure it did not cost him whatever years he had left as well. What followed, over the next several months, unfolded the way these things always seem to for people patient enough to let the paperwork do the work. The sale of the Sycamore Court house was rescinded through a court finding of undue influence, the property restored fully to Arthur's name this time, rather than simply returned to a shared arrangement that had proven fragile once before. The funds from Raymond's trust arriving not long after gave Arthur, for the first time in his retirement, a genuine financial cushion of his own, that no one else's name sat on top of, and Helen Draper, facing both a civil judgment tied to the current fraud, and a renewed, painful public reckoning with the decades-old embezzlement, that the statute of limitations protected her from criminally, but did nothing to protect from the judgment of the family and community, that had trusted her for so long, quietly moved away from the area entirely within the year, her daughter Diane choosing, after a difficult and tearful period, to stay close to Nathan, and to Arthur, rather than follow her mother. Nathan spent a long time, after the mediation, unable to look his father fully in the eye, and it was Arthur, sitting with him one evening, on the very porch steps the movers had once carried his recliner down, who told his son that he understood now that Nathan had been managed by an expert, the same expert who had once managed a much younger, much angrier Raymond, and that the real tragedy of the whole business, more than the money, more than even the 11 days, or in this case 11 years, of estrangement it had briefly threatened between father and son, was how much damage a truly convincing liar could do to people who loved each other perfectly well, if nobody in the family ever thought to ask a second question. Nathan, staring out at the same driveway, where he'd once learned to ride a bicycle, asked his father quietly how he could ever forgive him for standing in that doorway and saying what he'd said, and Arthur told him the truth. Which was that forgiveness hadn't come all at once. And wasn't finished coming even now, but that watching Nathan choose, in that mediation room, to sit without Helen present, so he could hear the whole truth unfiltered, had told Arthur something worth building on, that his son, however badly managed, was still a man capable of choosing truth over comfort when it actually mattered. Diane, for her part, spent months wrestling with a grief that had no clean name to it. The grief of loving a mother she could no longer fully trust, and she told Arthur once, tearfully, on a Sunday afternoon, at the house on Sycamore Court, that she kept turning over every kindness her mother had ever shown her, looking for the seams, wondering how much of it had been real, and how much of it had simply been the same patient, practiced warmth Arthur described from that old trucking company office. And Arthur, who understood exactly that particular grief, better than almost anyone alive, told her only that a person could be capable of real love and real theft at the same time, that he'd come to believe that about his own brother's ledger and about Helen both. And that the not knowing, painful as it was, did not have to be resolved today or even this year, in order for Diane to go on loving the parts of her mother that had, in fact, been true. Arthur moved back into the house on Sycamore Court that spring, planted new roses along the same fence line where Margaret's had once grown, and on the first anniversary of Raymond's death, he drove out to his brother's grave for the first time in 11 years. Sat down in the grass beside the headstone, and told him, out loud, that he finally understood, that he forgave him completely for the 30 years of silence, and that whatever guilt Raymond had carried into that trust and that letter, he could let it go now, because his brother's last quiet act of love had reached him exactly when he needed it, and that was, Arthur said, worth more than every one of the 30 years it took to arrive.